This is something that I think has been brewing for a long time, especially when it comes to Confederate monuments.
Spurred by the protests over the deaths of George Floyd and other Black Americans at the hands of police, monuments to the Confederacy, Christopher Columbus, and other figures are being taken down. But what does that mean?
I think that what we're dealing with right now is we're looking at the ways in which the people that we honor in public spaces are being questioned.
Dr. Sarah Beetham teaches art history at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. She says the recent movement to take down Confederate statues began in 2015, after the gunman who murdered 9 Black parishioners at a South Carolina church was seen sporting Confederate paraphernalia.
Right after those images came out, people really started to talk about the ways in which Confederate statuary is very much connected with all of the things that are happening right now when it comes to police brutality, when it comes to inequality for all people of color, but especially for African Americans, and how this much longer history very much affects what's happening today.
Following the shooting, South Carolina removed the Confederate flag from the grounds of the state capitol. More and more people started to call for the removal of public tributes to the Confederacy.
Things accelerated in 2017. The first major city removed monuments. In New Orleans, 4 major monuments came down.
And now the move to remove statues is picking up even more speed.
What's happened in the past couple of weeks is that no one is waiting anymore. With the police brutality that's been taking place and with the protests related to George Floyd, these monuments have very much become a symbol of everything that's happening, of all of the frustrations that people are experiencing, of the coronavirus, and the fact that the coronavirus is very much targeting communities of color much more than it's targeting white communities. And so all of these things are coming together to cause people to really pay attention to the monuments.
Another thing, says Beetham, it's actually pretty easy to knock down a lot of these monuments.
Our monumental stock is in very poor condition. These things have been sitting outside for centuries or decades at least. There are all kinds of environmental reasons that monuments are unstable. Climate change, acid rain, all of these sorts of things, problems with the statues when they were first put up. And so the statues themselves are actually very fragile. And I think people are realizing that it's a little bit easier to tug them down than they may have thought before.
I think many of the people that are knocking down these statues don't even have any idea what the statue is, what it means, who it is.
President Trump recently signed an executive order aimed at keeping those statues up.
Are you angry?
Yeah. People are tired of feeling like they're not heard. People are tired of not being a part of these processes and not having any clarity.
Dr. Kate Bean is a member of the Flandreau Santee Sioux Nation. She works as a scholar for the Minnesota Historical Society.
People are tired of systems of power which have been put into place to oppress, and they're doing something about it.
One controversial statue stood not far from where Dr. Bean lives and where George Floyd died in the Twin Cities. It was of Christopher Columbus.
The Christopher Columbus statue here in St. Paul was erected in 1931, and it means a lot of different things to different people. It was a symbolization for Italian Americans who were trying to assert their nationhood, were trying to assert themselves as Americans. It's kind of ironic in the ways in which they were trying to fight back against discrimination against their own communities by asserting themselves as Americans. But in doing so, what they did in honoring this person, the first Italian to come to these lands, what they did was they honored somebody who not only represents an entire history of genocide and colonization and an erasure of the indigenous people, but who directly was involved in a history of genocide.
In recent years, the legacy of Columbus has been reassessed, and many people, particularly indigenous communities, don't like what they see.
To many people, this statue symbolizes a justification for the doctrine of manifest destiny and a history of genocide, and that Columbus had this lasting negative effect on entire societies and nations. It does not create a welcoming space for us as indigenous people.
In early June of 2020, St. Paul's Columbus statue came down. Dr. Beetham says this is nothing new when it comes to public statues.
Monuments are actually not permanent. The whole history of creating our public landscape is a history of change, a history of constant amendment, a history of adapting things in order to make them work for our modern societies.
Tearing down statues and idols is an age-old practice, known as iconoclasm.
There have been statues torn down and thrown in rivers pretty much ever since there were statues. They look like people, they represent very, very big ideas, and they have often been targeted by groups of people who want to protest against the state or against much larger issues at moments all through our world history. You can find examples in ancient Greece, in ancient Egypt, in ancient Rome especially, where it was very, very common for statues of emperors to be torn down and either destroyed or repurposed and made into something else.
Dr. Beetham says recent statue removals at the hands of crowds are a result of a larger frustration.
What I think is really happening right now is that because of some of the state laws that have been passed, all of the avenues that could have been used to remove these statues in a legal way or in a way that was much more measured have been taken away. And so people are very frustrated and are now targeting the statues and bringing them down to show that frustration and to say that they're not willing to wait anymore and that the statues just need to come down.
And what of the charge that taking down statues equals erasing history?
Statues themselves are not history. Statues are memory, perhaps. Statues are important aspects of visual culture. They can certainly tell us things about historical moments, about the people who put them up. The other thing to keep in mind is that anything that happens to these statues is itself adding other layers of history to them. So, we're looking at all of the scenes taking place in front of the Marty Lee statue in Richmond right now, and the ways in which that circle has been created by investors. Every night they're projecting images of Frederick Douglass and George Floyd and Harriet Tubman and all victims of police violence onto that statue.
Some of the removed statues are destroyed on the spot or dumped into rivers. Some may wind up in museums, but what happens to them is all a part of the history we continue to interpret and tell.
What I hope comes from this is that some of these public spaces start being reinterpreted so that they're more accessible to everyone in the community, and so that they start to more reflect the entire breadth of who we are and not just one very narrow view of history.
What is happening is that the historical narrative is becoming richer. It's becoming more complex. It's becoming more truthful, and it's being inclusive of people who've been left out for far too long.
This is Inside Edition Digital.